Good evening. Good evening, everybody. So we're quite excited to be here to talk about content because we've been hearing about marketing. But I always feel like, the mediums change, channels change, but ultimately what counts is what you say, and that is content. And today there is a writer in all of us, so I'll quickly introduce myself because I've been on the writing shoe and the publishing shoe as well. But there's been a writer in all of us, and everybody is a writer today, everybody is a publisher today. So how do we then navigate this world? How do we find our own voices? And how do we make sure that the voice that we have is relevant to the platform and the channel on which we are speaking? So just a quick word about myself, and then Amit will introduce himself. I've written 2 books, but I've also been a publisher for Harlequin, which is a multinational publishes romances. In addition to that, currently I'm heading a brand strategy firm, and again, interestingly, we use digital content in a very different way, in some ways that you might have heard of today, speaking about brands, speaking about products, speaking about services, and so on. So it's a very different lens and a very different kind of content that comes into play over there. And I hope that today we talk and have a very interesting dialogue about what it means to be a writer today and what it means to be a publisher today in this digital medium.
Yeah, so now I am the kind of writer that has just been given a really bad name, the journalist. But I assure you, I am not an entertainment journalist. I have worked extensively as an online journalist, but prior to that, I used to work in print. I have worked with the Times of India group and the Indian Express group, but I spent months with them, where I've actually chosen to spend my career with more independent and alternative forms of publications, people like Time Out magazine and this website called Mumbai Boss. And now I recently founded this website called the Daily Power, which is a city-centric website. It basically it's about Bombay, tells you things to do there, and basically we want to be your guide to the city. Our tagline is keeping your city fresh. And for me, I think the most exciting thing about working online, and Amrita asked me this just before our panel, as to why I decided to make the switch, was, being on the web as a journalist gives you so much freedom as opposed to being a print journalist. Just to give you an example, when I was working at Time Out, I was the music writer there. I would cover, concerts, albums, and I would be restricted by a word count at a very basic level. And, that means depending on how many pages I got from my story, whether there was an ad on that page, I would give in 300 words, 800 words, at best 1,400 words, which is sometimes, really not enough for what you want to say. But when you're online, you not only have the freedom to decide how you're going to present what you want to present, and not just how many words, but it also frees you up to make the experience so much more layered. When I'm writing about a band, for example, I can, if I'm mentioning a band's influences, I just have to link to an artist that they talk about. Or if I'm referencing their music, all I have to do is, embed a video or a sound clip, and then you're getting to listen to hear what I'm talking about. It's not just me, not just my voice that you have to you're reading. It's not so. And that was one of the main things that attracted me to making the switch from being a print journalist to being an internet journalist. And I wanted to ask Amrita as to, but it's kind of different when you're when you're writing fiction, for instance. Obviously the clear differences. So how different has that experience been, when you were, as a print, as somebody who ran a publishing house, who working mainly in print, and then you made us, and you've seen the switch over happening, nowadays with every kind of, now just the very, the introduction of the Kindle itself has changed the way people read. So what are the key differences that you found?
So I think first of all, let me just lay the stage of how publishing is really working in India, because for any publisher, when we are talking about books, at most 3 to 5% of books are being sold digitally, which are then read through Kindle or any other format or any other device. So 95% of books are still in India, print books. Now this is different when I look at my counterparts, if I looked at my counterparts in other countries where they had, say, anywhere from 30 to 50% of any particular book or any particular genre would sell in the digital format over Kindle or over your mobile phone or Kindle on iPad or whatever device that you read it on. So clearly in India, it's it wasn't a huge driver for us. And publishing, I think to some extent, the exciting changes that are to come are still to come in the future. So when we think of books, you're still thinking of let's say 40,000 to 50,000 to 100,000 word length. And it really takes a different kind of ability to actually conceptualize that book, to write it, and then to engage with the reader who's reading that particular book. So as far as a novel or a non-fiction publishing of books goes, it's slightly different, where the digital medium becomes more of a marketing tool, an engagement tool. How do you reach out to people? How do you tell what is it that you are writing about? Because as there are so many screens, there are so many formats, there are so many channels of entertainment today that reading as a habit is really fighting for time. Right? So authors today necessarily have to be marketers and necessarily have to reach out to people, and then the digital platforms become a way. But what we were increasingly seeing was this whole notion of flash fiction. So flash fiction could be 3,000 to 10,000 word long stories. Now it's still not a huge revenue driver for a publishing house, because there is enough and more free content out there on the internet which people can publish and people can read. So there are other platforms and free platforms, so it doesn't become a money generator, but yes, it's there. The other interesting thing that's happening now is Twitter novels, blog novels, and it's it's a really good way to engage with readers. It's very instant, it's very topical. There were formats like haiku before. There were formats like sonnet poetry before. I mean, our own Vikram Seth wrote a whole novel in sonnets. Dorothy Porter out of Australia has written a lot of books which are short, non-rhyming poems strung together into a story. So maybe there is room for exploration of new kinds of writing, which is happening now.
Yeah, but what about in terms of an approach? I mean, while you're seeing a lot of writers experiment with different formats, do you, I mean, for instance, when you knew that your book was going to be read also, on a tablet or, on Kindle, I mean, did that change the way you sort of approached?
So, the straight on Kindle doesn't really change the reading format, your approach to writing as much, because you're still, it's still a very linear read that you have to do. Now, there are some new devices which are being experimented with at the moment, where you can actually, just like you build in things into a journalistic site, you can have links.
Yeah.
Right? And you can have links not just to names, places, explanations, and so on, but you can actually link it to brands. So you're in building marketing. So imagine you're reading a novel which very few people read today, and then even there you can have brands coming in.
Basically ads.
Absolutely. Yeah. But you must be seeing a lot of that, right? the interlinked world of journalistic writing and curating content online is very different, I think.
Well, the thing is, this is a question that I'm often asked as to, is there much of a difference? And I really feel that there isn't, because as a writer, I think your basic job is to make your writing interesting. It's just as easy to, click the next link as it is to flip the page. So, but what I do feel is that you do have to sort of figure out what works best for what story. Like, for instance, at the Daily Pow, we have different sections. We have a section on food, we have a section on culture, and we have a section on shopping. And what we found is that when it comes to something like shopping, people really want to see what you're talking about. So you would sort of pick out say you're reviewing a store, what we do is we'll sort of go and take photographs of 10 things at that store that we think are interesting, that people should, are worth buying. Or we're doing a roundup of a certain kind of new product. Or if it's like, cool new graphic t-shirt designers that we really think are interesting feature, we will sort of put in a link to some of their best t-shirts, and we put in a link to sort of buying, where you can buy them. So I think that's the other sort of thing that you have to figure out what works the best for which story,
And I think, one of the most exciting things that I find online is that there is an absolute democratization of content, because each one of us is an individual, and each one of us wants to read and consume, some different kind of content. So today, the internet really offers that platform that I can write whatever I want to write, and there is a reader out there for me, and that reader will find me. It's not as easy as saying the reader will find me, so you have to do a little bit of effort in making sure that the reader does find you. But the good news is that once a set of readers find you, more will automatically come through to you, which is very different from traditional publishing, because in traditional publishing, the publisher is curating, right? It's what is coming on my table as a publisher, and what is it that I like, along with my team of editors, of course, and that is what I'm the gatekeeper. But on the internet, there is no gatekeeper to some extent. I mean, you have curators,
yeah,
but
I mean, I think
you can bypass
where,
to some extent.
No, I think that's where somebody like us comes in, right? I mean, you have why is anybody bothering to sort of come to a website to have basic information? But the thing is, you're offering more than information, and I think that. Now, this is one of the things that we find between, say, print and, say, newspapers who cover the certain kind of things that we do. One of the things that you'll find at most newspapers in their feature sections, I mean, where basically our website is a features writing website, right? At a newspaper, a feature writer will be divided into two types. One is the Bollywood beat, which is, as you've heard in the previous panel, perhaps somebody the entertainment journalist, and you will see that out of 5 pages devoted features in a newspaper, 4 will be for Bollywood and film news, and 1 will be devoted to other kinds of, whether it's theater or music or film. And so it's one person, quite often, the same writer who is sort of being asked to cover. Today you cover an art show, tomorrow you cover a play, day after it's a music concert. So you're not really getting any depth of knowledge, and it's quite simple. I mean, as newsrooms are run today, you find that this is how it works. I mean, it doesn't make sense to hire 5 people to cover 5 different beats for just 1 page. The advantage that we have is that we are, we are basically specialized in what we do. And that's, I think, what you have with the internet. And also, one of the advantages of the democratization of the internet is that you have experts who are so sort of, clued into what they do, the so-called geeks and the nerds, but those are the guys who really know what they're talking about. So if you really want a depth of knowledge, you can get that on the internet, which sometimes you don't get in other forms of, in print, for instance. And you can get, sort of superficial kind of stuff also. Often people say that they get their news on Twitter or Facebook. But look, you'll get your news, you'll get the headlines. But even if you don't click on that link, or if you're just seeing the headline, you're not going to get you're not going to get beyond that, because all the news headlines are the same, right? They all say the same thing. This happened. If you want to know why it happened, if you want to know how it happened, you're going to have to sort of click and go beyond that. But, I guess it's very different for you. I mean, when you're sort of having to examine, in the publishing world, how to sort of navigate this, the online space. And have you found that it makes any difference what kind of genre you're dealing with? Because you have different, I mean, for instance, you write thrillers, right? So, how do you find, how have you sort of integrated that aspect into writing and editing?
Sure. So I think, again, there is a difference in where we are in India at the moment versus where, it tends to be outside of India. So outside of India, from my counterparts, I would, I know that when you're looking at genre fiction, when you're looking at, say, romances, thrillers, mysteries, ghost stories, whatever, so which, are fast reads, people are a lot more willing to engage with that content on the go, on the move, and hence, on your electronic device, versus, something that requires, a little bit more of thinking, probably, you really need a quiet spot, and, then that would be different, and, they might prefer to engage with it on a print medium. And but in India, I think where we are at is that when you're writing stories, when you're crafting your story from a publishing perspective, you're really thinking of the story itself. The story has to be the hero, your protagonists have to be the heroes. The plot, the way it drives forward, that is the important part. Because it is ultimately a long form of writing, and it is not just a long form journalism, right? You literally this is 10 times the length of a typical analysis piece
average,
that you might think of, right? So the reader has to be engaged for the 2 to 3 to 5 hour duration or more that the reader is going to be spending with the book. So the book becomes important, and then the digital medium, it's not that different when you're reading a book on Kindle versus whether you're reading it in print.
But it's interesting that you said that when you're sort of more like crime fiction and the kinds of like what you call a fast read, that kind of stuff works better on this. But when you're is it more literary forms of journalism? More literary forms of writing, wherein a heavy sort of. What would you say? What about in terms of what about poetry, for instance? Is that something that you find that works well with electronic medium?
So I think poetry is something that could find its place, perhaps, in social media, because today poetry, unfortunately, has very few takers, and it's a really beautiful form of writing, and it really lends itself so well to social media because you're condensing thoughts into very few words, right?
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of poetry, and that's what attracts people. And what I've known from influencers, and we had a panel of influencers, and I was speaking to other kinds of influencers, and what they've told me, even in India, when they, obviously Bollywood, gets a lot of engagement, and so, sports get a lot of engagement, but if they put out Sher-o-Shairi, that tends to get a lot of engagement, and it's something because it's in a succinct way, in a witty way, you're communicating something.
Yeah. And what about nonfiction? How far has that been able to?
So nonfiction, it's really interesting because nonfiction lends itself beautifully to the digital format, right? Because you can literally, you can zoom in on texts, you can zoom in on charts, and so on. And so one is writing the book itself. Right? So in writing the book itself and taking it to the digital medium, the way it is sort of laid out and the way it is structured is you can do some interesting things with it. And then when you're marketing that particular book, the way you put information out on different channels, it's not just Twitter there. Then you have to be on, let's say, if you're a subject matter expert, then you talk about it on Quora, you build your following on Quora, you put out infographics on Pinterest, and you try to generate interest through that.
Sure.
So there are different mediums that you can use if you're a nonfiction writer to then really amplify your message. Because ultimately, as a writer, what do I want to do? I want to write because I want to communicate with my reader, right? And how do I communicate with my reader? And and especially today when attention spans, as we all know, are really limited. How do we engage with them? So then these mediums become really important in engaging with people. So tell me, for you, when you're curating content, what is the lens that you look at? You mentioned subject matter experts and experts writing about things, but what is the lens? What's the voice that you want to generate?
Well, at the Daily Power, the kind of voice we've decided to use is, I'd say we want to be your digital concierge, somebody who you'd go to for advice. And advice being not really serious advice, but stuff like, where do I go to eat dinner tonight? what's the one like gig worth attending this week, or which film should I watch? Those kinds of things. So the kind of voice that we've adopted is neither is it too sort of frumpy, which sort of a lot of say writing tends to be. If you read, sometimes you read writing about certain subjects and be really obtuse. And then at the other extreme, you have like really kind of frivolous tones where people, are writing. I mean, we are very conscious of the fact that we're not a blog. A blog is opposed to a website, and our style is informal, but it's not, it's not superficial. And I think that's the one thing that we've made clear that, so it's kind of like this. We want to be the person that you come to for advice, but we also want to be approachable enough for you to be comfortable to come and say, you know what, I'm not going to be talked down to, or I'm not going to be dumbed down to, when I come to a website like that. And that's the sort of, I think, throughout all the publications that I've worked at, I mean, I think that's been the general sort of tone that we've taken, I think, because that is the, I think that is sort of the tone to sort of take with, you shouldn't insult the intelligence of your reader, which often you find people do.
Well, yes, there is sarcasm. But it's an interesting point as to how do you really talk about different genres of books on different platforms. So for example, for Harlequin, we had a very strong line of books under, say, Mills and Boon. And it had one of the hugest engagements that you can think of in the social media world for a publisher. And the whole tone of voice over there was very interactive. It was very, sort of soft, fuzzy, warm, loving, you're my friend, and we're talking about relationships, and we're talking about what makes you happy, and people really engaged with that. So we had a whole sense of one-on-one equal parity engagement on that. Now, when I look at other books that we published, so for example, if it's a nonfiction book, and if it's a book on whatever topic it might be, the author and hence our stance on that particular book would have to be more of a sage, a philosopher. I know this topic, and hence I'm talking about it, whatever it might be. It might be as simple as parenting. It might be as out there as a book on entrepreneurship. So whatever it might be, the author in that case has to have that tone where it connects, but also make sure that the reader knows that the author is an expert.
Sure, but that's interesting because authors sometimes, and being writers essentially, I know that you can often have various types of personalities, and quite a few authors are not on social media, and so then you sort of have to, have you had that experience where you're sort of almost kind of warming them up to the idea of getting on Twitter, or like you said, other sort of mediums, say Instagram or whatever it is, and because, and how comfortable have you found authors being sort of having a different kind of persona? Because I mean, as an author, you're essentially, and especially a fiction writer, you're creating these worlds, and because you actually, it's kind of like you're separating yourself from the rest of the world by the very nature of your job. So
I think today you cannot have an author who says that I will not engage on social media. You do still find some of them, but interestingly, many more are very open to having a persona or a set of personas, as you're talking about, and when reaching out to readers, because it's important. And if you think of let's say J.K. Rowling and whatever she does through her books and through the movies, if you go to Pottermore's site, I mean, that is a way the books have been monetized way beyond what could have been imagined by a traditional publisher, what could have been imagined by even the film producers, right? So there's a way of engaging with audiences. There's also a way of monetizing your writing, and it goes beyond. In India, yes, there are a lot of commercial authors that people either love to love or love to hate, and they're very active and very avid on social media, and they engage with their readers, and the readers respond, and there are two ways of looking at publishing, and there are two ways of looking at any kind of writing, right? So yes, in earlier eras, authors were necessarily shy creatures who lived in their ivory tower and wrote and didn't really want to interact with the world. And there was an instance a couple of years back at Jaipur Literature Festival where Katsi came, and he's a Nobel laureate, amazing writer, extremely reclusive, doesn't really want to engage with people. So there was pin drop silence. He spoke softly, people listened. It was a huge thing for him to actually speak to an audience like that. Jhumpa Lahiri, again, another reclusive author. So there are still reclusive authors who manage who cut across, because the writing is and the voice, the story itself is so powerful that it doesn't need that medium of interaction and engagement to reach out to people, to reach out to readers, and to sort of get imprinted in people's hearts and minds. But more often than not, you do. Right?
Yeah.
And we've had instances of really interesting instances. Again, with my firm, globally, we had authors who were very popular in the fantasy genre. And in the fantasy genre, they go, really wild with social media, because they have alternate universes.
And they have hardcore fans.
They really have hardcore fans. They have hardcore fans. So anything from Harry Potter to even the kinds of girly fantasy, action adventure fantasy books that we created, they were diehard fans. And the characters had their Twitter accounts, and the characters would live on Twitter, and fans would engage with those characters, and it was a really live way of engaging with people and continuing the book between series, because in anything like that, in a fantasy genre, series is important, right? So you need one of 20, right? So how do you generate enthusiasm for the 20th one?
So how does that work? I mean, is that the author doing that, or is there is there a whole team, a marketing team behind that? It's sort of you can let us in secret and tell us whether it's actually the author or all those Dumbledore Twitter accounts, or is that really? It
has to begin. See, I think Dumbledore Twitter account may be different. There might be a fan account, fans running those accounts. But increasingly, authors themselves have to be engaging
and
online.
Sort of creating these different
and creating so if the in many scenarios, if the author is really huge, then there is a huge team of publishing marketeers and so on, who would be helping out with that. But the author needs to still be willing to engage on that platform, because the fans are coming as much for the characters as for the author.
Yeah, it's just kind of strange. But luckily, of course, anybody who has watched Indian TV news knows that Indian journalists are not short of things to say. They all have opinions, and so you will see a lot of them very active on Twitter. For us, interestingly, at the Daily Pow, we're three of us, and we're actually three very socially awkward people, and we have sort of figured out a way to engage with our readers in a slightly different way. And we were talking about formats, and one of the formats that we've decided to use, and which surprisingly is kind of underutilized in India, is a podcast. Now, what we have started is a podcast about how three journalists with absolutely no business background have decided to become entrepreneurs and start this website. And we launched with that story, and you can sort of see, and that sort of tells you our journey in a way that us writing a run-on sort of story would definitely not be able to tell you, because you can sort of see the difference in our voices from the first podcast to the latest one that we did. And we're not doing too many. We only want to do them as when we have something important to say. But in the first one, you can see how uncomfortable we are with the whole idea about talking about ourselves. And by the third one, we got relatively more confident. So, there is kind of different ways to sort of package content, and that's something that we've found as journalists, the web gives us. And but interestingly for you, for instance, we've seen nowadays this whole, was it Amish Tripathi that had a video for his last book?
Yes, I think today everybody has a trailer.
Yeah.
Right.
A
So
trailer for a book, which is
a book trailer, because ultimately we are visual people, and it's quite sad because you're talking about the it's sad and it's exciting that you're talking about the written word, but in order to attract readers to the written word, you have to use different formats. But interestingly, to your point, if you think of The Fault in Our Stars and John Green, who is such an international phenomenon, and he is one of the most followed people on YouTube. So he runs this vlog with his brother, and it's not just about his writing. He'll talk about any issue in the world, from teenage education in America to animal killing in Alaska, and he'll talk about it. And what he does have is he's got influence, right? And what he's doing is he's using his influence then to communicate with his readers on a variety of topics. Educate, entertain, whatever you call it, but maintaining that contact, and sharing his journey, sharing his thoughts.
Yeah. So we're seeing it being used extensively as a marketing tool, as a communication tool, as a sort of a fan connection medium. But what about emerging writers, people who are just starting out? How effectively can they use social media to sort of build a fan base? Because a lot of the people that we know, we talk about, authors on these mediums, they're all people who already have an established following. So if I'm a writer coming out with my first book, is it really, has that been effective so far to find people using it?
I'll ask the question back to you, but from a publishing perspective, the digital medium really has been a huge equalizer, because you can, authors have the ability to publish their own stories, their blogs, and many authors, even in India, have been discovered. Their voices, their stories, their way of writing, both in fiction and non-fiction, has been discovered through what they are putting out there in blogs, in in social media, in posts, and so on. So it's an excellent way to get started, to get noticed, to build your repertoire, and really writing like any other craft. Like music, like art, like any of the creative mediums. It's a there's a practice and there's a craft to it. So that 10,000 hour rule perhaps applies equally over here in writing. So many young writers, if they continue to write on a daily basis, which is what the advice used to be even, in older times for traditional, writing platforms that write daily, write your 2 chapters or 300 words a day and so on. Now it's so much more easier because you don't need to just write it in your diary. It doesn't need to go unnoticed. You can publish it. You can publish it daily, and soon enough somebody would notice you. And do you find the same thing with journalists?
Well, of course. Again, one of the biggest differences between print and online is the instant feedback that you get. And I think even for writers, right? Even for authors, you know exactly what people are reading, how many people are reading it, and which can be both exhilarating and sort of heartbreaking, because when you find out that, you might have written this sort of long analytical piece about something that you're really passionate about, and the most read thing on your site has been a list. It's always a list of 10 things to, best places to eat butter chicken or whatever. And but it's not as long as as long as some people are reading the more sort of in-depth stuff, then, you don't feel that depressed. But, I think instant feedback is the biggest thing, one of the biggest advantages of the internet and social media, for instance. When people are sharing your stuff or people are, talking about something that they're really excited about it. And this is the way that sort of, for instance, we've also used social media as ways of teasing news. For instance, if it's a new restaurant opening, we will put up a picture on Instagram, and people will and then say, come back to the site for more information later on and things like that. So it's both things. You get feedback, and you sort of you also share stuff out there, which not necessarily you might have just you're walking past. Literally, we've actually done this. If we're walking down the street or in a cab, and you see something new, you'll get out of the cab, take a picture of it, tweet about it, and then you'll go back the next day and find out what the story is. For instance, recently there was a fire in Bandra a couple of months ago, and some restaurants. This has been the KFC building, and it had this really popular restaurant called Kofuku's Korean restaurant. It had this other ice cream shop that got burned down. So one of our writers was actually there. And look, if it was any other fire, I'm not sure we would have necessarily covered, because we're not a news website, but this was of interest to our readers because, hey, we write about these places all the time. And, if something's happened to it or if it's shut down, people would be interested. So
I'm curious a little bit, just to shift gears for a second and ask you a tough question. That with so much of analytics at hand and so much of monitoring of engagement levels, is there a fear that what you curate might get skewed in a particular direction, crowding out the important and sort of the fast and the furious and the urgent and the immediate gets more visibility?
Well, yes, unfortunately, but then at the same time, you want to write for people who, you want to give the people what they want to an extent. But like I said, I think the important thing for you to do is to make sure that you're not dumbing down your content, right? You might be okay, so you decide, okay, maybe nobody wants to read about, a certain kind of theater, for experimental theater. Nobody's reading about it. You might be really passionate about it. So you decide, okay, I'm not going to focus that much on that. Does that mean you stop writing about it completely? Not necessarily. Okay, but you don't do 5 pieces a month. You'll do 1 piece about it. Or, then do you increase the amount of stuff that people do want to read about? Now, one thing that we don't do is we don't do a lot of Bollywood content. And that is automatically means that, we're getting a lot of people who aren't coming to us. But there are a fair amount of people who are inundated with Bollywood content, are just not interested in another site that says the same thing. So you're getting a different kind of reader. Now, do we want to sort of be everything to everyone? We can't be, so we're not going to be. So we've made a choice that, and true enough, if we sort of we do film reviews because we think, that's sort of a guide and people do watch films. We're not going to do Bollywood news or gossip or any kind of that kind of thing. But with the film reviews, we'll find that consistently they get a decent number of hits because, hey, film like food is something that everybody is interested in. But we sort of decide, we make sure that there's a healthy balance. And yes, we have found that, you have to, we decide, okay, we don't do, we change the way we approach something, we don't necessarily, we're not going to push something down people's throat if they're just not interested in it.
So, one of the exciting things that happened because of the digital format in publishing was that we have something called the Longtail, which means that there are a few books which sell a lot in print, and print requires a lot of logistics, right? First you need to print, pay in advance for the printing, so there's a lot of any seed investor, I've always likened myself to a seed investor, where I'm investing money in a particular author and his or her writing. So you put that money out, you ship the book, and we all know how logistics works in this country.
Yeah.
So you ship the book out to multiple bookstores. It sells, it doesn't sell. Now what happens with the digital format is that different kinds of writings, which have necessarily fewer readers. So for example, science fiction, or if you're looking at a book on geography or rivers of India or something, which might do well in limited quantities in print, ends up having a much longer life online, ends up having a life in the first place online, because it's just so much easier to identify, publish, print, curate, edit for the digital platform. So necessarily then you end up having a space for these kinds of books and writing, which unfortunately in the last few years has been getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, but like you said, the long tail is something that, it's as an approach we too use, because, you know that there's different kinds of audiences for different kinds of things. But have you ever experimented with sort of stuff that's only published online that you don't think would lend itself to a print version? Vice versa is also true because, I suppose, when you're looking at a coffee table book of photographs, it's obviously meant to be, have a hard copy, but...
So yes, and that's the exciting space where you're looking at many books which are print only or print first. So there are entire so in publishing we have imprints. So it's so there are many imprints that we had which were digital only or digital first, and digital first means that it first goes online in a digital format, in an ebook format. If it does really well, then we print out a few some copies and it goes out into the bookstores as well. So I think today writers are also comfortable with being online because they know that they can find an audience online. And certainly, that's a space. The other thing that's happening quite a lot is chunking, where we take a book and that you put it out chapter wise in either a serialized novel or how did Sherlock Holmes come to play originally it was every week serialized a story would come out. So similarly serialization on the digital medium is happening. Chunking of non-fiction chapters so if it's a book around say marketing, we don't need to have the whole book. If I'm interested only in social media marketing, then I can only buy the chapter on social media marketing and so on. Right, so there are many interesting ways in which it can be done.
I suppose that's also an economic decision because
it's economical for the reader, right? So then the readers come
and for the publisher because you're not investing in. You're not killing trees and for the environment as well.
Yeah. Well, there is a certain charm to print. Still in when you're looking at books. But increasingly there are other forms of writing where we would.
For sure.
Discover authors first.
Now this is something that, of course, the advantage that we have as opposed to, book publishers is we can actually use Twitter as a story generator and as a source. And I've seen this increasingly in the recent past where, sites will do, and this is kind of lazy journalism in some sense, just the recent incident where you saw, the whole British Airways, Sachin Tendulkar thing, where, people published 10 funniest tweets about the Sachin British Airways sort of controversy. And at one level, this guy is just, whoever's been assigned this task has just been sitting, has gone on Twitter or wherever and is copy pasting. That's all they've done. On another level, I think, okay, maybe there's been some effort and you're relying on this person's judgment to see out of the thousands and thousands of tweets, hopefully, that they've gone there and actually seen, and not just seen the first 10 that they found, that they've actually done some amount of curation, if you can call it that, and sort of, done that. But at the but that's one way that you can use social media to actually give you a story. And especially nowadays when, you're expected to sort of generate so much content to sort of gain attention and to engage with readers because they're so hungry for stuff, right? And no matter how much you give them, they just want more and more because there's, somebody's coming to your website, they're not going to come back every day unless you give them something new. And another way we did this is the previous website that I worked at, we would sort of generate a story out of say some random person suddenly came into the news, say some obscure film star, he's suddenly trending on Twitter. So we'd actually make a story out of it and say, why is so-and-so trending on Twitter? And, tell people who actually want online that day, what was going on. And...
so tell me, do you find it tough to find authors, online journalists who will give you those insightful pieces?
Who will give us those?
Who would so how do you find journalists who you want to include on your platform?
Well, now this is the thing. We get approached by a lot of writers, and everybody who says, I want to write. Now this is a standard email that we receive almost every week. We get 2 or 3 of these, which is essentially, I really like your blog. Blog, firstly, when it's a website. So I really like your blog, and okay, so the next line is going to be, can I write for you? So our standard reply is, yes, thank you so much. We appreciate the fact that you're enjoying it. Can you send us some ideas? 9 times out of 10, we don't get a reply. People just want to write. They think that, because like you said, the online is democratic, I can write anything, I can write whatever I want, and somebody's going to publish it. Why not? Why won't you publish it? And this is what I find that, the kind of how do we find writers? It's very easy to find writers. It's very difficult to find a good writer, and to me, the definition of a good writer is somebody, not necessarily somebody who can write like in the who is really eloquent, say, but somebody who has a basic understanding of the language and basic understanding of grammar, and somebody who has ideas. That to me is a good the kind of person I'm looking for, because you can train somebody to write better. You can teach them grammar. You can sort of train them in certain ways, but you can't train them to sort of look at the world differently, because that's what you need. I mean, I guess that's the same with authors as well, right? That's what you need. You need somebody who everybody can write, right? Everybody wants to write. We've all been made to sort of write compositions in school. So we all have that basic idea of, write a short story about so and so. So we've all done it, but, not everybody can actually has that skill.
Now, I'd completely agree with you on that. Now, I'm going to open up to questions, but I can't resist adding one comment to that. That in publishing, especially, you see a lot of authors sending you their first stream of writing, and expecting that will get published, and there is so much of editing, chiseling, polishing that is required, and all of the great writers you can think of do that. So clearly, there's a lot of lazy writing, that does get submitted in the hope of, finding its way into print somehow. So now, actually, I'm getting the signals here. So let's see if we can open up to questions.
Have any questions?
If there are any questions. So we'll probably take two.
We just got time for one.
One? Okay. Okay. So we'll just take one.
One quick question.
I don't think anybody has a question.
Any questions? Any questions?
We can.
Okay, there's one. Hi, my name is Vinita, and my question to you is, there are a lot of thought leaders on social media who are now experimenting and getting into blogging. They want to experiment using Instagram and different platforms. But since they are little geeky, or they are more into B2B and not so much trained into social media marketing, what are your thoughts on or tips to them? If I were to ask top 3 tips for them to be more active on social media, how can they leverage their social media channels?
Well, one of the ways, and I tell this to people who also ask us questions, any sort of form of writing, is maybe you start looking at the people that you follow, or whoever somebody wants to sort of learn how to be more engaging. Who are the people that you follow and who you like and who you think are interesting? And you just observe the kind of stuff that they do. And, so that's a great start, is just sort of follow. Secondly, I think that the idea is what you say has to be more than just information. On social media, people are looking for an opinion. They just don't want information, right? So if you're, say, somebody who's working in a B2B field, you want to sort of present some kind of analysis, because you also have some kind of, you have a greater level of understanding about a subject than somebody else, because you're surrounded by a particular depth of knowledge, and that you meet people in your industry who sort of. So I think that's the second thing to do, to sort of make sure that you're saying something more than just a statement, something that sort of gives. It's difficult to do, say, on something like Twitter, where you have only 140 characters, but that's a skill you learn with time, where you kind of learn how to say something that nobody else is saying. A fresh thought about a subject that you haven't seen before, but you have. I mean, do you wanna?
So I'll just give you two quick things. One is channels matter. So Twitter is not the only one for a subject matter expert. Think LinkedIn, blogs, think Quora, so there are other platforms. If you are writing about something that lends itself to infographics, then Pinterest. So there are multiple platforms, A. I think the second thing is that there is a certain immediacy to it. So keep writing, because, if you think too much and don't execute, you'll keep thinking.
Yeah. So
I think with that, thank you.
Thank you.